And other than that, we'll get started. If you have questions at any time, you can interrupt me, and I do not care if you just unmute yourselves and pipe up. I'm cool with that. I like to go with the flow like that. You can also raise your hand if you're more comfortable with it. My job tonight is to help you write your essay that you have coming up based on Constancia. It's also to help you with your discussion post that's coming up. And this is a complex piece, and the reason that I wanted to meet on Zoom tonight was really just to get together to help you understand the story better and to put names and faces together, at least to some minor degree. So let's just fire away. This story is a novella, I mean, a short novel. It's 60 pages long, and it's the best novella I've ever read. And that means a lot. Carlos Fuentes, the author, is one of my heroes, and I think that this is his masterpiece. And that says a heck of a lot, because this man was a world-renowned literary artist. And for you who are in an introduction to literature course, you know, starting off with something like this can have its challenges because you've probably trained yourself to read things a certain way. So the first point that I want to make as we jump in here is that your main character is not Whitby, it's not Constancia, it's not Plotnikov. It's history itself. And it might help you as we get going tonight just to take a few notes for your own essay, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Sure, we have three main characters: Whitby Hull, white boy, empty white boy. He's Fuentes' version of 1989 America when this story was written. We have Constancia, who's representative of the Virgin Mary as an artist. And Plotnikov, the term Plotnikov means carpenter in Russian. And so they are Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Their child, Jesus, died, right? We know that from reading the story. If you haven't started it yet, I'm just giving you a heads up. So these characters are patterns more than anything else. But what moves them is history. What changes them are the forces that Fuentes witnessed in his own life. So let's start talking about that a little bit. Fuentes was born in 1928, and he died roughly a dozen years ago. It's hard even to remember. He lived to 82. And, you know, when he was little, he's ethnically Mexican, but he didn't even live in Mexico until he was 16. His parents worked as diplomats, and he lived throughout the world, including going to grammar school here in the United States. And he spoke perfect English. He spoke a lot of other languages, actually. But when he was 16, he moved to Mexico for the first time. And at that point, he started to discover his own history, his own ancestry. And it became so important that he worked it out for the rest of his artistic life. When he was 16 in 1944, actually 1945, you know, as he's coming of age and he's becoming a young man, the atomic bomb is dropped. And, you know, in the Stalinist purges in Russia during World War II, 20 million people were killed by Stalin. They were artists, intellectuals, thinkers, actors like Plotnikov, because that's really what he represents, is all those artists who were killed by Russian Orthodoxy. 6 million Jews were killed by Hitler. And there's reference in this story to a man named Walter Benjamin, who was a real life person, and we're going to talk about him in a little bit. In the Spanish Civil War, Constancia represents Spain. 200,000 people were killed. 500,000 people were exiled. In the story, Whitby goes back to Spain after Constancia disappears, and he tries to get documents to nail down exactly who she was, and he really can't. The pages are blank. And that's really important because it doesn't matter who she was. She was one of 500,000 people who had to flee for her life. She would have taken any identity she could have, gone anywhere in the world to survive, and what she wanted to take with her were her memories. And it's the same for the Christ child, as King Herod was trying to kill babies and Mary and Joseph were on the run, right? So what Fuentes is saying is that these patterns of history repeat, and they're bigger than human beings themselves. And so if we look at this story as I'm supposed to get X out of it, and I'm supposed to understand if Constancia was Spanish or Russian, no, it doesn't matter. No, she was a person. She was a woman. She suffered. That's what matters. Was Plotnikov lying to Whitby about the day of his death? You'll run into that question as you read. No, it's metaphorical, right? So let's move on from that point and to get into Whitby a little bit, because he will be the subject matter of your essay. I've already mentioned what he represents. He does die metaphorically when he shaves in a mirror in the story. He also dies metaphorically when he walks into Plotnikov's house and sees him in the coffin. There are a couple of different deaths that he has. Whitby's shaving is kind of, I call it the Mesoamerican or Central American death, the Aztec death, if you will, because there is a god that the Aztecs believe in named Zipetotec. If you want to write it down, it's Xipetotec. And it was a serpent god, and it changed its skin. It shed its skin like a snake, and that shedding of its skin was like rebirth. There's a moment in the story in which Whitby shaves off the old Whitby and is reborn into a new one. And that's just one of the many deaths that he has. So as you think about Whitby and his deaths and his growth, don't think of it as linear, like he's born and then he dies. That's kind of limited. Think about it in terms of his emotional growth, his growth into accepting others, and the best way to put it is his growth into being a heart surgeon who has no heart, to becoming a person who is going to take in a mother, father, and child from the Civil War in El Salvador and give them a place to stay and feed them. That's what we're talking about when we talk about his growth and his death, right? It's a new life for him to show that. Now that might help answer your essay question, but there's so much more going on here. Again, you can ask questions at any time, but what I'm going to do right now is share the screen with you, and we're going to look at a couple of pieces of art that are going to help you understand the bigger picture of what Fuentes is after here. So let's move in that direction. All right, so do you see, somebody holler and say yes, you see a painting on the screen right now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right, so we're going to talk about this and one other painting, and these two things will really open up your understanding of what literature can be. In fact, it'll probably blow your mind a little bit, and I like that. So there's reference in Constancia to a man named Walter Benjamin. It sounds like, or it's written like Benjamin, but it's pronounced Benjamin, Walter Benjamin. He was an artist, an intellectual, a thinker, and a Jew. He spoke out against Nazi tyranny, and he knew by doing so that his life would be in danger, yet it was his calling, an absolute necessity for him to do so. He saw this painting here that you see on the screen that was done by a Swiss man named Paul Klee, who also spoke out against the Nazis. Paul Klee, his last name is spelled K-L-E-E. They were contemporaries. Benjamin's story is interesting, and it is this. The Nazis were on his tail. He was fleeing them through occupied France. He did not want to be caught. He knew he would be tortured, not just sent to a concentration camp, but given the worst treatment possible. In the case of his capture, he brought a suitcase with him. It contained all of his important manuscripts and vials of morphine, and he told himself if the Nazis found him before he was able to get into Spain, he would overdose by shooting up and killing himself. He was at the Spanish border, had gone through France, got to the border and was rejected. Could not get into Spain because of the Civil War. Again, these ideas that kill people. So he killed himself. just as he promised. Now, just months before doing so, he saw this painting that you see on the screen, and he wrote his own interpretation of it. And I want to read that to you just by scrolling and then talk about why it's important. So just before doing so, you'll see that this is Angelus Novus is the title, right? The new angel. It's the angel of the 20th century. The one of 20 million dead in Russia, 6 million dead in Germany, the atomic bomb, 500,000 Spanish exiled. So this is not a Renaissance angel of flowing hair with a harp heralding God. This is a thing with chicken feet. Looks like bird wings with human fingers. There's a tower at the center of his being here and a pendulum that's swinging. And his hair is all curly. It's very human, but also very limited, right? This is not an angel you'd expect. So here's what this is Clay's painting. And here's what Benjamin said about Clay. All right, I'm reading this section right here. There's a painting by Clay called Angelus Novus depicting an angel contemplated and fixated on an object, slowly moving away from it. His eyes are opened wide, his mouth hangs open, and his wings are outstretched. This is exactly how the angel of history must look. His face is turned toward the past. Where we see the appearance of a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which unceasingly piles rubble on top of rubble and hurls it at his feet. Much as he would like to pause for a moment to awaken the dead and piece together what has been smashed, a storm is blowing in from heaven. It has caught itself up in his wings and is so strong that the angel can no longer close them. Remember those little bird wings? That storm is so powerful that he can't close them. The storm drives him irresistibly into the future at his back, to which he turns his back, while the heap of rubble in front grows sky high. What we call progress is this storm. So this angel is not capable anymore of making change, being a prophet, being a herald. It has been absolutely abused and disempowered by history, disenfranchised, if you will. There's nothing left of it. And that leads us to the question, what is left? What can change history? And it's really important to answer that as Fuentes would answer it, and the answer is you. You who are in this Zoom meeting tonight, you who are students, you who are thinking, you who are interpreting the world, you who are going through this trauma that we're all experiencing right now, what are you doing about it? How are you living your lives? Are you comforting others? Are you trying to stop this storm, spread your wings in a different way? Those would be the questions that Fuentes would ask. There is a definite push on his end to engage you as readers into creating meaning, to grow, perhaps as Whitby did, or in your own different way, but absolutely to engage the world with conscience and with care. So, to repeat, these are the words of Benjamin. You're going to see him in the story. He is mentioned. There's only about a page of him, but he's there. The painting, you can look it up on your own by Clay, K-L-E-E, Angelus Novus, and that'll help you understand what Fuentes is after here in Constancia. I'm going to show you one other painting, which I think is even more important. And I think it's only even given one very brief mention in Constancia, but it's so important to Fuentes that it will help you know where he's coming from. So we're going to switch there. This painting is called Las Meninas. You can see the title in the search box, and the artist is Diego Velázquez. It's obviously an old piece, coming up on, 400 years old now. And still, for Fuentes, this was one of the most important paintings ever done, and he considers it like the first to be highly modern that touched on the realities of our world. So I want to talk about it and explain to you why Fuentes values it and why you should too, as artists yourself, or as readers of art, at least in this case, reading Constancia. So, I mean, just as factually speaking, if we're looking at this image, the Meninas means the maids in waiting, right? So we have the Infanta here in the center. She would be the little princess, and these are the Meninas, right? Her maids in waiting who are there to attend to her. None of that's really important. We have another person in the room, a nun, and it looks like a cleric here as well, and a pooch in front. None of them are necessarily important. In the back, although you can't see it because it'll be too small on your computers, this is a frame which contains a picture of a man and woman, assumed to be the king and queen. In other words, it would be her parents, right? Now, we also have two other figures here who are very, very important. It's this figure in the doorway, and I'll talk about him last, and then the artist, right? So a typical interpretation of this painting, which would be incorrect, would be that this painter, who is Diego Velázquez, okay, is painting the parents, right? He was a court painter. He got his money and his shelter and made a living by painting portraits for the Spanish court. So this would be his patrons, right? The king and the queen who paid for him. And the assumption is that they're sitting outside of the canvas and that the painter is actually looking at them. Right? But that's not really what's going on here. I think something much bigger is going on. I have seen this painting in Madrid in the Prado Museum. It's massive. It has its own wall. And the perspective here, unfortunately, is small. But when you see this painting live, you can see he's holding this brush away from the canvas here. It's not touching it, right? And that's something really important, and it relates to this figure here. If this is Fuentes, if this is Velázquez, if this is the artist, whether it's a visual artist who is about to work on a canvas or a literary artist like Fuentes who's working on his typewriter, in order for their art to have any meaning, to have any heart that Whitby lacks, it's necessary to have you. There's got to be an audience. There's got to be an interpreter. In the case of a novella, there's got to be a reader, right? And so what's really going on here is that this artist with the brush in midair is waiting for you to be his canvas. Every student in this classroom who's reading this piece of art, he wants to know how he's touched your heart. He wants to know what you're thinking about. He wants you to create the world as you see it. He wants you to be an active participant in the creation of meaning. And who is this figure? That's you. It's anybody who stands in front of the canvas and looks at it at the Prado. It's anybody who opens a book and reads and tries to interpret the world. And I think it's open because we don't know if this figure here is descending the stairs and coming into the piece of art, or ascending into this light and maybe going back into his or her, if you will, reality, right? It's on the precipice of the two, that point at which reality and art meet, okay? And looking in there as a way to engage it. So yeah, I'm saying, you're reading this story, and Fuentes is saying, yeah, I'm making you not Whitby Hull, right? I'm asking you to be active in taking part in creating meaning and giving the world meaning and being open-hearted to interpret these things and to make art live through you. And that's a pretty profound thing. You as students must understand from this point on in your education, whenever you read something, whenever you do something that requires you to think, no instructor should ever tell you what's going on, but should guide you into you applying whatever you see to your world and making it part of your future. And that's a really important message for Fuentes. It's a really important message for me, because this artist here, he's waiting for you. All right. I hope that makes sense, but none of the story of Constancia is there to make sense necessarily. It's there for you to interpret and for you to come up with truths as you see fit. Let me come back to regular screen here. So as you read, again, you will have many questions. They will be enigmatic, if you will, very puzzling, sometimes very confusing. Students ask me, is Constancia a ghost? No. Was she a real person? No, not that either. What is she? She is an archetype. She is a pattern. She is the symbol of the suffering woman. Any woman who has lost a child to history, any woman who has had to flee in exile, cross the Rio Grande in an inner tube to be alive, that's what she represents. The fact that Whitby can't get her name on his marriage certificate with her doesn't matter. Remember, 500,000 people fled Spain. We don't know what their names were. They changed them so they could survive. They took other people's belongings. It doesn't matter, right? They had to figure out a way to keep their history alive. That meant themselves, but their dreams and their desires.
Just trying to see if that one works. This one's comfier.
Somebody should, I'm not sure who that is, but let's check it. The same thing is true for Plotnikov. He represents all artists, all fathers who have lost children due to history, all artists who have lost colleagues due to history. He is representative of those 20 million Russians who died due to Stalin. Whitby is an innocent because Fuentes would say, living here in the United States, he's never had to face such tragedies. And again, this was written in 1989. So he's just naive and he sees the world in one particular way. And Fuentes is saying, if you're really going to grow, if you're really going to move into history as it actually exists, Whitby, you need to take into account the lives of all the immigrants who came here from wherever they came, whether it was African Americans in chains, Mexicans crossing the border, Jews fleeing Nazi persecution, whatever it was. Unless you get their books on your library, you haven't learned a thing. And I'm using Fuentes' own words here. So again, don't be worried about not knowing these facts about Constancia in particular. Think about it in much broader terms about the movement of people and how their names are obliterated by history and how they have to recreate themselves by borrowing identities, by living through other people, by depending on others to give them shelter and comfort. There will be some things in the story that you're going to find just weird, and that's okay. And I'm going to give you a heads up on one of them and explain it. There is a part where Constancia dies, and they're metaphorical deaths, and they're real deaths, but this is one where she seems to die and then come back to life. And while she does that, and she's, I believe, in the recovery process, she starts dreaming, and she dreams of stories about different things that are going on in different parts of the world. There are two young men who fall in love with a mannequin, right? And then she dreams another story, and then she dreams another story. And what's happening is that Constancia, is the first story in a collection called Constancia and Other Stories for Virgins. And what she is doing is she is dreaming the rest of the stories that Fuentes will write in the book. So all the stories that follow Constancia in the actual book are the ones that Constancia dreams. It's kind of a really good narrative technique, but that's just what's happening, and you wouldn't know that unless you read the rest of the book. Okay, I've been talking for 20 minutes, and I want to make sure that we're on the same page, and just turn it over, raise a hand or just pipe in. Do you have any questions about
How does she die if she's not actually alive, so to speak?
Well, I'll try to answer that. You want to qualify that just a little bit? I want to make sure I'm understanding your question properly. Is this Michaela?
Well, yes, this is Michaela.
Before.
Well, you said that she wasn't really alive, so to speak.
No,
So,
she's a living, breathing person. Whether or not her name is Constancia, we don't know. Again, and the reason is because so many people had to borrow identification to get out of Spain and start a life again. But she is Whitby's wife. She is at least a Spanish speaker, right? And Catholic. So we doubt that she's Russian, but she could be. We don't know if she's changed that much about herself. What happens in the story is that Whitby sees her die, and from his kind of mechanical view of death that a doctor would have by taking the pulse, he diagnoses her as having died. But what he doesn't understand, and this is where we get into the kind of the more spiritual, more ghostly elements of this story, is that she is much bigger than a single death. She is the Virgin Mary. She is any woman who has died suffering, right? And she will be born again and rise out of the ashes like a phoenix. So her entity or her essence is much bigger than this particular life. Did she actually die? Yeah, according to medicine, yes. But according to history, the suffering keeps going and she has to live. She's a part of it. So Michaela, I hope that helps. It's not a rational way of looking at the story, okay? But you're not supposed to look at it rationally. And that's one of Fuentes's points. He says, don't go through this like Whitby, who's a detective and who wants to get the facts and all the dates and all the names. And Fuentes saying, you can't. You can't. You have to open your heart to suffering. That's what this story is about. And if Whitby sees her as just dying, he's going to miss everything else about her life. Does that help? You want to follow up?
that makes sense, but in a way where, like, it makes sense, but doesn't. It makes sense that it's not supposed to make sense. Does that make sense? I don't know. That's a lot of senses.
No, you're right. That's exactly right. It makes sense because it's not supposed to make sense, certainly to Whitby. You know, he's only going to look at it like a patient died on the table or something like that. What he doesn't understand is what her death represents. It's one of those things that causes him to live, to grow, to change. When he actually would go eventually, when she moves across the street, if you will, she has to go to Plotnikov's house after her death in Whitby's house because she's returning to her old self, her life with Plotnikov. When Whitby understands that she's much more than what he wanted her to be, almost in the story, he viewed her as a sex slave in some ways. I mean, she was his wife, but he didn't even dare to speak her language, right? He didn't dare to understand her on any emotional level or anything like that. And so her death was just kind of a natural return to her own past. And his growth, in part, is to understand who she is on a much more complex and just more global level, I guess you would say. To understand her suffering is his growth. Okay. More questions? Keep firing.
Yeah, I kind of felt like with death, it brings new life in a sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And with Whitby's death, I think he comes back to life as born again in the sense that when he's in the plane, he breaks his silence, and then he comes back and thinks, "Oh, she's home. She's home," and he runs in and finds this El Salvadoran family in his house.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of saw that as his rebirth. You know, am I tracking right?
No, I think you're right on. And, you know, and again, the Civil War in El Salvador in the 1980s exiled so many people. One was my good friend who was a Spanish teacher here at MJC named Tony Pacheco, right? He had to find a new life and adopt a new language and find a new identity, something he had never known, just like these people who turned up on Whitby's doorstep did. I think one of the, your understanding is right. And one of the questions I'd ask you, Paul, and it's kind of rhetorical, is, all right, early Whitby at the beginning of the story, if these people showed up in his door, what would he have done, right? And so now he's gone through enough to, again, be more accepting. But yeah, they are representative again as mother, father, and child, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, you know, Plotnikov, Constancia, and child who was lost to history. It's those patterns returning again. Right on. keep firing questions, guys. If I can help you in any way, I appreciate those of you who've asked so far. I love it.
If you could, what was the quote you said the author said about not being able to see everyone's story? Sorry. If you don't know somebody's story, then what was the rest of it?
I don't remember exactly where we were when I mentioned that, Alex. Could you rephrase for me while I think about it?
So I think you were saying something about how the author said, because you were talking about how all the different refugees were fleeing their respective countries to get away from the horrors from them.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have all of those books on your library and you haven't read them, then
Sure. Yeah, so that's actually a really big point here. I appreciate the question. I'm going to be honest here. I'm going to give you an answer, and I didn't necessarily want to because it's really complex. So I'm going to try to condense a semester worth of a lecture into 2-minute response to you. Here's the deal. Whitby represents many things. He is a naive America, but he's also Don Quixote. Now, Fuentes would argue that the most important novel ever written was Don Quixote by Miguel Cervantes in 1602. Okay, came out at the same time as Hamlet. All right, very, very brief. I'm gonna try to do this in 2 minutes. Don Quixote was like Whitby because he ordered all of his reality and all of his thinking on a very limited basis. He had a library, but it was a library of books basically that he had chosen, much like Whitby. They only reflected the things that he wanted to see and that he wanted to read. Now, Quixote, when he ventures out of his little town, right, La Mancha, the history of Spain, is like Whitby living in Savannah in this kind of labyrinthine heat that he's in. He's never really stepped out of it. It's all he knows, okay? Quixote, when he goes out, he sees the world differently because he sees it now from everybody else's perspective. The horror of Spanish colonization, what it was like for the Native Americans, how many people were lost due to disease, all of those things, that has never been on his library shelves, right? In the same way, Whitby only sees African Americans as chromatic irony, black people picking white cotton, right? That's as much as he can see. So my point to you with this really wonderful question is that Whitby represents the closed-minded thinking of somebody whose learning is limited and only reflects a certain reality that, let's just say, well, I think I said it already, is what he wants to see, what he's comfortable with, but yet does not reflect a totality that we would call reality. He's never had to step outside of a position of power and wealth and privilege and be seen as he actually is. Quixote would do that. Whitby is doing that in the process of this story. Does that help, Alex?
yes, it does. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, of course. Fire away with other questions. Please, anything, y'all. All right, I'll wrap it up. I don't mind going.
Professor,
Sure.
when did you want us to post this paragraph on?
Thanks for asking that, Paul. So the discussion says, I just want you to write a paragraph in which you kind of summarize what you learned in tonight's Zoom session. I'm not worried about the due date on this one. You know, you're going to need time to process it. So please just do it and just do it at your leisure sometime before the essay is due. And I'm fine with that. I don't think there's a date on it where there's a limit to when you can actually submit it. So don't worry about it. Just get it done when you're ready.
And then where do we submit it at? I didn't see a place for it yet.
Yeah, it should be in the discussion link.
Oh, I see it.
The discussion button. Yeah, okay. I was going to check myself, but if you saw it, I'm confident it's there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, as we...
Okay, so, oops, sorry.
Oh, wait, no.
For this like discussion, if it makes a lot of nonsense sense, is that okay? Because like I got a lot of things going in my brain that make sense but actually don't make complete sense.
I am more than happy with that. In fact, I like the process, that you guys go through in sharing it. Do not be Whitbees and think that this has to be anything perfect. No. No. In fact, work it out. And if the discussion feels a little bit messy to you, that's a good sign. Okay, Michaela. And
Perfect. Thank you.
And, if you have questions, you can always email me. I appreciate more questions. I mean, whenever I'm starting in wrap up mode here, but it doesn't matter. I'm just going to say, my office hours are Thursday from 8 to 1. And I don't just sit in front of the computer just waiting for somebody. So I do want you guys to go ahead and email me to set up a specific time if you'd like. And if that doesn't work, just anytime during the week pretty much will. So I'm more than flexible whenever things arise and you need to ask questions, whether it be about just reading or helping with essays, all right? And don't be shy, please, this is my job and I love working with y'all. This might require 2 or 3 readings. It's one of those thick stories that might take you an hour and a half to read, but an hour and a half is not enough to process what's going on. So I do recommend that you take notes in the margins, you highlight things, and you just I call it reading dirty because you're always making margin notes where it just looks like somebody's been manhandling the page. And highlight some quotes that you might want to use in your essay, or at least you think are powerful and you want to think about. And those will forward it so that, maybe a second reading might do it for you. I really do hope you enjoy it. And I'm dead sincere when I say to you, I think this is the best novella I've ever read. And I hope that you get the same feeling and joy that I did when I read it for the first time. And I've read it probably 30 times and I still learn something new every time. So I'm not looking for perfection here. I'm just looking for engagement. All right, with that, I'm just gonna send you off. It's 10:38 here in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I want to give you some good vibes. Mardi Gras season always starts on the 6th, which is the Epiphany. And we're going strong. It looks like we'll have Mardi Gras this year out here. I was born in Modesto, but I live out here now. And I just want to share with you a good communal sense of well-being that I'm feeling in the area right now. And I hope that the world improves for all of us in these next few weeks. And I'll be thinking about you and I look forward to working with you. All righty. Good night, everybody. Thank you for taking part.
Have a good night.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night, night.
Thank you.